Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me and for your kind words, Benjamin. And I would like to thank the organizers very much, especially Jana, Benjamin, and Nico, for inviting me. I think it's a very big honor to be asked in a circle of such impressive scholars and many of my friends. And in that way, it's really difficult to, do what you wanted from us, yeah, sort of, or at least for me. I spent a lot of time thinking about what to do. I guess that's what you also wanted us to do, yeah, sort of think. And I also believe it's difficult in the sense of, giving constructive criticism. What does that mean? I don't want to be patronizing or matronizing would be the right word in the sort of gendered language. And also I have some theoretical and also some empirical ideas, of course. But what I thought I would also just use this time a bit, part of it, to sort of think about how one could do something if one would integrate discourse theory with critical discourse studies, or actually my own approach, this discourse historical approach. And so what I want to do is first talk a bit about what I see as questions and challenges, also on the background of what I've heard during these very intensive and most interesting days. And unfortunately, none of us can be at 3 panels at the same time, so it's a selective view which I have of those 2 days. But anyway, also having been at the postgraduate workshop, I have some ideas of the forthcoming new innovative work of PhD students. I always think PhD students are the most important people because they're so privileged. They really have time. None of us has time anymore. But PhD students actually usually still have time to read. And when you once are in your job, you have very little time to do this broad reading. So I thought this was really important to be part of this workshop. I will then address one issue specifically. There are many, of course, and I know that Michael will address others. But one issue which I find very interesting and where there is a overlap between my interests and several of our interests and the interests of discourse theory is change. Socio-political and discursive change, something which has been at the core of critical discourse studies in Norman's books and also my work. How do we actually also trace the trajectory of change, not just speculate about it or illustrate it with a few text extracts here and there, but actually try to trace it, to make it, to understand why something changes when and by whom and with what effect. And I thought this is actually a point where we meet very well, so I will show you some of our work and we can discuss how that fits. It's at the crossing point of conceptual history, discourse historical approach, and I think also discourse theory. And then I want to make some conclusions and sum up. And I will try to do this in the time I was allotted to, which is much too little, of course. But okay, well, first you said we had 40 minutes, so I had to cut. Yeah, it was very difficult. So I went back to Torfing, which is a book I really like to read, and in his introductory chapter, the book which was edited by David Haworth, he has sort of 3 challenges which he mentions in 2005. The book was published 2005, and he mentions the first challenge is that discourse theory should demonstrate the analytical value also in empirical studies. And I put underneath, beyond the illustration of arguments and concepts, it's the big question, do you work in an abductive way, which is something I very much propose and have done in my work, or do you work in a deductive way? That means you have this set theory and then you look for examples which fit, something which has also been criticized in critical discourse studies, by the way. And both is legitimate. I mean, you can do both. One just needs to know what one is doing, and that the deductive way doesn't allow for elaborating theories. It just means to reconfirm what you already know with new examples. The second challenge, which Torfing mentions, is which topics are addressed by discourse theory, and he says at that time, 2005, it was mostly gender, ethnicity, and social movements. Right now it's of course much more also populism and nationalism, so things have moved on. And the issue is which other areas could one work in? Are there crossovers again? And finally he mentions that at 2005 people weren't reflecting enough on questions of method and research strategy. Now, having listened to many papers in this 2 days and also in the workshop, I find that many speakers have actually been reflecting very much, both from inside discourse theory and also from outside. So some have been critical in some ways, have mentioned points like that history hasn't been implemented enough. There are people who also context dependency hasn't been thought about enough. So there was already some reflections. So some of the questions I would like to raise are, which I would love to discuss, what are the big problems discourse theorists would like to solve? And I say problems because I actually support a problem-oriented way of doing research, which also implies not being dogmatic, but actually on a meso level using various theories and also methodologies which are adequate to kind of approach a certain problem. Right now we live in a very complex world. We were just hearing about anti-globalism and various really complex phenomena. None of these phenomena can only be approached by discourse theorists or critical discourse analysts or by experts in ideology or whatever. We need to work together with sociologists, historians, political scientists, etc. So I very much endorse this problem orientation instead of just keeping in sort of your own theory in focus. The second question I have, having listened to many issues at this conference, is actually the question of, are there other emotions being investigated except jouissance, which I understand and have read Yannis's stuff. But I myself, as you know, have studied a lot about the politics of fear. And I was just at a conference in London where a colleague had a wonderful study about anger, which is very, very important right now. In German, we talk about the Wutbürger, the angry citizens who are on the street and who make up the voters of the populists. So how do these emotions play out? Yeah, and does it make sense to focus only on one of those areas? And the second question, and that's the one I will be looking at in more detail now, is there really something like an empty signifier? I think no. I think this notion makes very little sense, to be quite honest. This is the most critical thing I'm going to say, so don't worry. Coming from Wittgenstein and from his philosophical investigations, so we say always the late Wittgenstein, Wittgenstein II, meaning always is constructed in use. And there is no use of any word which doesn't have a meaning. We can understand things in different ways, in ambivalent ways. It can be vague, ambiguous, whatever, but there's always a meaning. And in that way, the notion of empty signifier in my own research makes little sense. And I will talk about this more. And the third question I have is really, why are discourse theorists so frightened of linguistics? You work with language, you work with text, why don't we work together? Frequently I hear, well, those linguists, they have all this jargon and it's so difficult. Well, I can tell you, you have a lot of jargon and it's also very difficult. So maybe we can meet, yeah? I know that some of you are using discourse analysis and linguistics, and I'm exaggerating now, but there is so much we could know which feeds into your work and which would be, I think, very useful. So I want to go to this example where I want to sort of overlap with the interests of, I think, of discourse theory, which is the question of normalizing far-right concepts. Now, this is the typical thing of the signifiers, or I prefer concepts. And I do link with conceptual history in that way. And I think that is a phenomenon which we are observing very strongly right now due to the far-right radical populist movements. I call this the post-chain era because this is going on without, any apologies, without any contextualization. The transcendence and breaking of taboos has become ubiquitous and not shameful anymore. And there's another aspect to shame, that it is also emancipatory. So you lose shame by identifying with this post-shame era. So there are two sides to it, but I will now focus only on the normalization of concepts. Now, many people have been and are talking about normalization, but again, you have to operationalize it. And so now I'm getting to this empirical stuff, which Benjamin has already warned you about. And I'm also not a positivist. I must say that I've heard this disclaimer by many in this conference. What we are interested when we look at normalization is what kind of struggle over meanings exists about the hegemony of meanings. That is exactly what we're looking at, and also as certain concepts metonymically condensing ideologies. So you use a concept which actually indicates a whole edifice of beliefs and values. And what we try to do in our most recent project on the discursive construction of Austrian national identity 2015, which is the sort of successor project to our book, are four sort of concepts. And I will only talk about the first one, which is Integrationsunwilligkeit. In German you can make those enormous long words, which means unwillingness to integrate. Yeah? It's become a very important, you would say, signifier or note. I don't know. I never know what is what. Yeah? The second concept would be illegal migrant. So that has become the overall label for everybody who's a stranger, except rich tourists. Yeah? And then the debate about border or fence, which was significant in the Austrian debate, and what is the upper limit for which number of refugees do we let in the country? And again, there was a debate about upper limit or a guiding number. Yeah, so there were debates about concepts which actually manifested these different positions. So what we did when we were studying this was first go actually to sort of the definitions of what does integration mean anyway in this hegemonic debate right now of conservatives They don't have to be far right, just sort of the overall hegemonic understanding in Western Europe, Central Western Europe. And Klaus Offe, I find, has, I guess many know this very interesting sociologist and founding member of the Green Party in Germany. And Klaus recently defines integration in the following way. In the context of migration policy, this concept is best reconstructed as a deal. Yeah? So there are two parties. Again, we have this antagonistic, the dichotomy, the society of the country of arrival, and you, the multitude of people who have irregularly crossed our borders in search for protection and a life free of fear. And the content of the deal is, in its most simplistic form, we provide, you behave, right? So it's a very prescriptive, normative way of defining what they are supposed to do. Sort of, as long as you do what we do, you respect our norms, and then you know this whole discourse, you're welcome. If you don't do that, you're not welcome, or you can even be punished. Yeah? So this is sort of the foundation on which we now can look at the trajectory of Integrationsunwilligkeit. Yeah? So what I do, and I know, why doesn't that work?
Works.
Yeah?
Yeah.
In this entire discourse, it's important for me to show you just briefly the historical context in Austria, which I could talk about at length, so don't get me talking. In the 1990s until 2010, this term was only used by the far right. Yeah? We looked at it in Google Analytics, and I will show you immediately, not Cambridge Analytics, Google Analytics, and I'll show you that. And suddenly, 2015, after Charlie Hebdo and the attack on the kosher supermarket, the mainstream took up this Integrationsunwilligkeit and connected that to a perceived threat of Islamist terrorism. It was complete, putting two things together which were not causally connected, but you can, of course, create a fallacious argument in that way. So if you look at that, this emergence of this difficult term, you see that in 2005, almost no notions. So in the whole German, of course, Google, but then suddenly, 2014-15, we have this huge analytical focus. And if you look at that then in detail, you see how it suddenly is being used by politicians, and I must emphasize primarily from the Social-Democratic Party first. Yeah? So, and I will say something about that in a minute. So, just to give you an example of the text, and we had loads of material. The first interview, which was given already on the 8th, immediately after Charlie Hebdo, was by the then local regional governor of Styria from the Social Democratic Party. And he was standing before regional elections, and he was trying now, and that never works, to overtake the right by the right. Yeah? So that doesn't work. And he already said, and you see here the argument, the cause-effect, that this attack on an editorial office leads me to say clearly that politics in Europe has looked away far too long. So you know this topos, yeah? It's a standing argument. And then he blames the EU, he constructs a threat scenario, those religiously motivated people who infiltrate our values, and now we have to sort of defend ourselves. And there comes the nativism, us, the native Austrians, he really uses that. die wirklichen Österreicher, yeah, the echte Österreicher. And then he says, therefore, those who show no willingness to really want to integrate, we should realign our rule of law differently. So there it comes from the mainstream left, yeah, because they're frightened to lose votes at the regional election, and they lost anyway. Yeah? After this pilot study, we then looked at this huge amount of data, and I want to emphasize again as a suggestion where we could work together various genres. Yeah, so we look at print media, legislation, parliamentary debates, speeches, and so forth. So we always have this triangulation of various data and genres, because only then do you get really an image of what happens. And again, I can only show you, we looked at all these legislation documents, and if you look at the use of Integrationsunwilligkeit, you see, interestingly, already 2006, there was a first law which tried to define integration and unwillingness, and then there was sort of a drop, and now I can tell you we have those laws which tell you that if you are not willing to integrate, you pay so and so many euros. What does it mean not to be willing to integrate? It means that girls are not allowed to swim on Saturday, Muslim girls, and Muslim boys in school don't shake the hand of a female teacher, and now they're also discussing wearing headscarves in kindergarten, although there is no little girl who wears headscarf in kindergarten. So a lot of symbolic politics. I have to cut, I know, so I will. So just to show you the resolution which then went through Parliament, and again I want to stress that we don't only look at the signifiers, we look at how they are used in argumentation, because only then you know how they're used to legitimize in what way a proposal, a claim. And here it is, people who do not accept this order of values. So that is now the defined hegemonic meaning of Integrationsunwilligkeit. So nothing is empty at this. At no point is this an empty signifier. There's always very clear debates about what this has to be. And it is necessary to be able to punish unwillingness to integrate. And in that way, they decided a law now. So I'm coming to my pre-final slide. The results of this sort of long study, and we did this with all these concepts, as sort of indicators of the normalization to the far right in the mainstream. Yeah? You see that this new recontextualized and normalized meaning enforces assimilation. Integration has become assimilation. Yeah? So you have a redefinition of the term. You see here the chronology of how this law is being discussed and implemented, and also the change in hegemonic politics from integration through achievement now to integration through punishment. So you have to be afraid, otherwise you don't behave well enough. So ways forward, after this little aside, I think it would be wonderful to integrate discourse theory with other socio-political theories and with linguistic and discourse analysis, because in that way we can all substantiate what we claim in a much more valid way. I think that more systematic empirical research would enrich the claims which many people make. I also believe that problem orientation is the way to go, not sort of illustrating theories, but trying to look at problems, and also then finally to think, how can you apply that? And one of the applications which happened in the presidential election campaign in Austria was the reappropriation of meanings. I showed that in Potsdam. So the concept of Heimat, which was a far-right concept since Nazi times and also before, was reappropriated by the election campaign managers of the Green candidate Van der Bellen, and it was one of the reasons why he won. Yeah, because he could suddenly also claim to be for Heimat. Yeah? So in that way, I think that would be a way forward, and it would be wonderful to work together. Thank you very much.